On that note, join me in welcoming Suparna Gupta, founder of Angan Trust and a Global Council member of Dasra, to moderate this discussion. Over to you, Suparna.
Hi, thank you for the introduction. So I'm excited to be kicking off this year's Dasra Philanthropy Week in conversation with co-founders and partners, Deval, Sanghavi and Neera, Nundy. Hi, how are both of you? Excited to start this week, I guess. So I want to start this conversation about your last 22 years with a little nostalgia of my own, because I founded Angan pretty much at the same time as you started Dasra, I think, maybe 20 years ago. And I remember sort of feeling my way around in the sector and asking, hey, how do I raise money? How do I hire a team? What do I do next? And thankfully, I was pointed in the direction of Dasra. And I remember coming to your office and you had a 3-member team. There was both of you and one other young man. You were in your home, I think your little flat, beautifully done little flat in Kandivali, which is a suburb of Mumbai. And I think you were working with maybe 2 or 3 nonprofits at the time. And on the day I arrived, you were really celebrating the fact that you had discovered a home service dabba, which served fresh Gujarati food. And I was thinking to myself, wow, they're quite new to India. But it's safe to say that I think things have changed drastically and dramatically in the last 22 years. You're now a vibrant team of 100. And I think you've had about 350 Dasra alumni out there, many continuing to do super exciting things. They've started their own projects. So you've sparked something off in really hundreds of young people. You now work from 3 to about 1,000 nonprofits and therefore have impacted, close to 90 million Indians. And am I right? I hope I'm getting the numbers right, but you've disbursed more than $280 million since you started. And what's really remarkable actually in the last couple of years during the pandemic, when so many of us as nonprofits were worrying about whether we'd survive at all, you've been able to disburse $20 million raised and disperse it in response to the pandemic, especially. And so congratulations in year 22, not only for surviving and thriving yourself, but also for making sure that your organizations and, those of us around you who are at the ground level are also able to work. But let me start at the beginning. Deval, I want to start with you because I do remember working with you in our early years and your early years when you were thinking about incubation. So tell us, where did the idea of Dasra come from? Was it a flash of inspiration? Did it grow slowly? Who did you tell? And what was the response when you started talking about it?
Yeah, no, sure. I think one of the starts, of course, was just visiting India quite often while growing up, visiting family here in Mumbai from the States, and just realizing the stark difference between what I had and what unfortunately others did not have. And just questioning how come such poverty existed, how come kids who looked more like me were sort of begging at traffic lights, and how could this be the norm and accepted as a society, and just arguing with my family and my parents, like we should be doing more. Why aren't we helping these vulnerable communities out, given we have so much? And I think at that time, at least, my family said, look, don't get involved. We're here just on vacation. These children and families that are begging, they may be part of gangs or something may have happened, so it's not your problem. And I could not sort of deal with that answer. And I kept thinking that, no, it is our problem and we should change something. And so that sort of, I guess, sort of pushed me to graduate a semester early from college and work in Mumbai at Mumbai Central with an NGO, the Community Outreach Program, volunteering with children who lived in and around the pavements of Mumbai Central Station. And it was actually in that sort of experience, I learned very quickly, while I thought I was the one who was going to go and teach these children, it was the other way around. These communities taught me about resilience, about compassion, about looking after each other. I saw a glimpse of society which I never saw before, and was amazed every single day on how these children looked after not only each other, but anyone who came around them. Yet how mainstream society, unfortunately, did not sort of reciprocate that level of kindness and tenderness. In fact, the only words of English these kids knew were "get away from me" and "don't touch me." And at the same time, these children were feeding all stray animals on the station, were carrying literally each other on their backs as they went from Mumbai Central to Dwarkaki School, about 2 kilometers away, and just really were thinking about what they could do for their own future and for their families, something, again, that was very new to me growing up middle class in the US. And so I think that was really the impetus of realizing that this is an area that I felt I could add value, instead of questioning and feeling honestly horrible of why I was given a roof over my head, healthcare, and access to good quality public education in the US. How come these other communities were not given that? Instead of me sort of complaining about that or worrying about that, it was up to me to sort of come to India and start Dasra, really with the goal of being an NGO for NGOs and helping these communities not only survive, but ideally thrive.
Wow, I like hearing you talk about learnings from the ground, because I always feel that just stays inside you for your whole life. So I guess you started, I remember, with us incubating NGOs and really helping us start off our work. But Neera, I wanted to ask you, how did you then after a few years decide to move from incubation to capacity building? And I think you started thinking a lot about scaling. I know I worked with you when Angan began scaling, and I was quite sort of taken with how ambitious you pushed organizations to be. And Neera, when you answer, do address the concern that people sometimes have that, listen, why are we always talking a numbers game? Nonprofits are here to do good, solid work. We don't want to just keep talking about impact numbers. But what does numbers and scale mean to you, and how did that happen?
Yeah, so I think both of us have our different journeys. In fact, I was a bit worried that Deval was going to disclose that the person perhaps who might have been most negative when he first brought up the idea of moving in New York. He's like, I have this great idea, I want to support other NGOs. I'm going to go there and I'm going to volunteer. And I remember my friend Nina and myself, we were all having dinner together. We were walking and I was like, you're crazy. You go do that crazy thing. And, I'm going to follow this path, and that ended up being Harvard Business School. And the reason I bring that up is I think my entry into Dasra, although it sounds very clinical, is from that angle, which was how can I work with, and how could we as an organization work with leaders like yourself, Angan, and others to help them realize their aspirations. And therefore using management as that tool was fundamental to what started our ability in feeling that we could add value. So we could never be on the ground, mobilize communities truly where the real work is. And so we've always ended up being one step removed, but recognizing that if we could help leaders be better in their aspiration, putting down things like numbers helps them not only plan, but also creates alignment around a vision. But I think what we've ended up doing and trying to be are bridge builders. So really trying to build the bridge to be able to represent all of your aspirations, Suparna, let's say for the community and the children that you really want to protect, to those who have power, influence, and resources. And so being that bridge builder, given the warped view of the world that we had been in, just felt like we could play that catalytic role. And so when we started Dasra, it means enlightened giving in Sanskrit, but we always had this tagline, catalyst for social change. And I still think that that's extremely relevant, although it has changed a bit as well.
And both of you talk about where you're at now. You talked about continuity, convergence, community. What is that? What's going on at Dasra now?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think to your point, Supernova, our goal, and we started off really with building the capacity of NGOs and helping them grow and scale. We were then and still now in awe of all of these phenomenal organizations that we have across the country. And our view was they're close to the community. Many of them are from the community themselves. They created a solution that they've actually piloted, and therefore it was in our best interest to support them and enabling them to grow. It was sort of a decade of doing solely this. We realized that, you know, for any organization to grow and scale, like Neera was just saying, they need access to other sort of resources. Capital being one of them. And it was sort of in 2009 when we launched this entire forum that we are speaking here today and saying, okay, well, how do we start bringing funders into the mix? In 2009, we had generated quite a bit of wealth within India by that time. We had billionaires that were being announced, individuals that were starting to say, okay, well, now that I have all of this capital, how do I deploy it effectively? And that's really why we launched this particular forum, is to have conversations where we can start bringing those who have access to capital into these conversations, can meet leaders such as yourself and so many other phenomenal leaders that exist across the country, and really through your voice, hear about the community. And it was sort of then in 2015, after I guess working with givers and receivers, we started realizing that actually government also has a huge role to play, especially when we're talking about the empowerment of adolescent girls or urban sanitation. And so then how do we bring sort of these three key stakeholders together, NGOs, givers, as well as government together, align on a joint and collective vision, whatever that sector may be, and then actually working towards that vision, not as adversaries, but more importantly, as partners for collective action.
So Sabrina, that's why we were very excited about the theme around convergence. It is about how do stakeholders like government, civil society, NGOs, and the private sector and funding come together, but keep community at the center. I think for us, over the years, we've had to be very mindful of keeping that in the center. And I think this year we've decided that that absolutely must be the priority. It is about influencing funders and raising the funds, but it has to be enabling the voice and participation, and ultimately the community being able to achieve, you know, what they want and what they deserve. And we see the future all about this collaboration. And so cooperating and collaboration, I also see, and we see, as fundamental to management. You know, aligning all of these stakeholders towards the community's needs is really the purpose of Dasra.
Wow, thanks. Exciting times ahead. So, okay, this was a great warm-up. Thank you for some nostalgia and milestones. I'm now going to get into some hard talk. I have prepared a few questions, and Deval and Neera are used to me challenging them quite often. We have healthy debates, but I'm going to encourage the audience, if you have any questions, to also, tough questions, to also send your questions in the chat box, and we'll try to get to them. So actually the first thing, you know, on a more serious note, I think it's always interesting to understand what organizations are worrying about, not because, you know, I want to demoralize and depress people at the start of the week, but more because I think when you know what organizations are worrying about, you also have a sense of what they're working on behind the scenes. So perhaps some of this is work in progress, but I think it's always interesting to have insights from leaders on where they stand on things. So I think the first thing I wanted to ask you guys is, you know, do you ever worry about how will Dasra stay relevant? You know, you just, Deval, you just talked about working with various players, the NGOs, now government, philanthropists. You know, what if NGOs say, hey, we become independent, we have access to other people, we don't need Dasra anymore? Or, you know, there are so many exciting and excellent players now who are doing similar and other innovative things. So we think of the big picture, what is the space you believe Dasra will occupy, and where are the gaps, and, you know?
Yeah, no, and I think it's been exciting to see, sort of, to your point, the maturity of the sector. And so again, 12 years ago, we were, you know, the first time sort of conversations happened on philanthropy were through these forums. And now we have multiple forums that exist: wealth managers, single family offices, and other groups sort of have their own gatherings and events talking about the development of the country, talking about philanthropy, and talking about socioeconomic indicators. So it is amazing to see that. The same way we launched a leadership program in 2006 called Dasra Social Impact, and we have multiple now incubators and accelerators that exist across the country, some within institutions, some within NGOs. And so I think just to see sort of how each of these sort of ideas, that many of them that we sort of started with, have now taken shape and form, and others are bringing their own perspectives and nuances to the conversation, I think is critical. I think for us, really, the grounding of why we exist is also important, and Neera touched upon this as well. For us, it was always and still is about the community. And so to give you an example, Suparna, we have groups now and have had groups in the last few years, thankfully, that advise givers on their giving. And some of them take the call, and there's nothing wrong with this, but some of them take the call of saying, whatever the philanthropist says, we will do. Whether that's a name on the building that's focusing just on legacy, then or looking at something that they deeply care about, that is sort of our vision. I think Dasra, given that we're grounded with sort of this community first approach from day one, our view is slightly different. The givers that work with us want to be challenged and say, look, your ideas actually may not be the needs of the community. There are other players doing A, B, and C. How do you collaborate and actually create greater impact than doing this alone? And so I think for us, it's sort of grounding ourselves in the community, I think is important. And as Neera spoke about collaboration, and that's definitely become a buzzword over the last 5 years, I think let's be brutally honest. Neera and I are not billionaires. Our parents are not billionaires. And so many of the players that have started now, which are amazing, they actually first created a lot of wealth, created a lot of networks, and now have come into philanthropy, and those voices are really important. But for us, we've been at it from day one. We're an NGO ourselves, and we remain to be an NGO, and I think that's why a lot of the groups that we work with resonate, because we face the same challenges that they face. Every year we have to raise money, every year we have to look at talent, every year we have to think about our own sustainability. And I think that's something that I think resonates with most of the NGO leaders that we work with day in and day out.
Yeah, I think being able to represent NGO struggles, I mean, I have noticed that organizations do feel very comfortable having you represent us in an in authentic way in this respect. But you're talking about being in the being an NGO, but I have to say to you that I think when you guys started work, things were much more polarized. There was the funders and there was the NGOs, and rarely the twain would meet. And so I'm wondering how you straddle both worlds, because was there a feeling that, where the business and the philanthropist people sort of sector felt more like, oh, they are in the Bleeding Hearts Club? And did the NGO sector sometimes feel like, they're pretty, they're talking this business jargon? I mean, I've often said to you, hey, what are all these words you all are using? They're not exactly us. So how do you straddle both worlds, and what do you wish that people got about you in, as you work at the intersection? It's always hard to be there.
So I think how we've straddled has changed as a result of not just us and our own learning and maturity, but also how the sector, has moved. I think what really made us very uncomfortable, let's say in the last 5 years, is that we were starting to be seen as elite. That, who are these accent people coming, and who are they to think about trying to really bring change? And anyway, they're sleeping with the funders, so does it matter? Are they really here in the spirit of the community? And I think that's where we would like, as an organization, to be better at addressing and really bringing out the voices and participation of community. And I don't think it takes away from the fact that we come from privilege. So I think just recognize, we don't come from wealth, like Deval was saying. And when I say we, I mean Dasra. We're not sitting on a pile of cash in the same way that other foundations do, but we still come from privilege, whether that's privilege of education, exposure, and access. And that's what we're saying, can we bridge that access just further down? And that's where you're seeing a lot more of Dasra's innovation, whether we're pushing our adolescence work to be more adolescent-centric, or the launching of this Rebuild Fund, which is really about proximate philanthropy and leaders Investing in leaders we've typically never invested in. So we are taking a look at, does everything have to be in English? Can we have hubs that are not necessarily all about English, but much more relevant to those communities? So I think it's taking us a bit of reorientation, and we're pushing ourselves to do that. But again, it's coming from recognizing our situation, where we're situated in the sector, and how can we therefore make the most of that. And I think that's where we've turned to saying it's not about one-to-one relationships, right? It's not just about consulting. We never started Dasra to be in the consulting business. So even though we get compared to Sattva, we get compared to Bridgespan or Dalberg, there is a capability around that and a competency that is core to what Dasra does, but it is not a driving business for Dasra. And therefore, it is about bringing those capabilities to NGOs, how they think and frame, how families think and frame, their giving, and ultimately, how do these collaboratives work? So our future really has two engines that are driving our work. One is around these collaboratives and how do we fire them up? We see many more collaboratives coming up. You see Edelgive starting a collaborative, you see Samitha starting collaboratives. We're going to need to start asking ourselves, what does it take to be a strong backbone? And maybe Dasra is not the backbone to all collaboratives, but NGOs can start thinking about being backbones. Their future growth and ability to scale can be a part of running these kinds of collaboratives, and it takes a certain kind of DNA and capabilities, and that's really where we'd like to place ourselves. And maybe Deval, you can talk a bit about kind of the proximate philanthropy side and working with the family side.
Yeah, no, I think it's especially in the last 2 years, I think we've all realized that there is such a wide gap between the haves and the have-nots, and that gap has been there from the beginning, but it took a once-in-a-century pandemic for us to realize that gap, right? And so marginalized communities, whether they were the informal workers that were locked out of their factories and their homes and are responsible for building the cities we live in, feeding our children and making India where what it is today, yet we literally have ignored them. They have not the same rights as we do. They are not able to dial into Zoom. They are not given the same social protections that all companies give 8% of us that are in the organized labor force. So thinking about that, thinking about the minority groups who are further subjugated to greater oppression, thinking about the smaller NGOs, again, to Neera's point, who may not speak English, who may have not gone to the IIMs, and, but are trying to make a difference, and who are honestly in communities and focusing on challenges that the larger NGOs are no longer focusing on. Unfortunately, the sector has got to a stage where even the larger NGOs are saying, look, we need to meet quarterly numbers. And whether that's driven by the short-sightedness of the CSR rules, which are pushing NGOs to sort of see results within a year span, or it's other funders that are coming to the table and saying, look, I want to ensure that learning outcomes improve by X amount by this day. A lot of the larger NGOs, many of them that we've also worked with, are now sort of saying we cannot go to the hard-to-reach areas. We cannot sort of focus on holistic solutions which are held to scale, yet are needed given the issues that exist in these communities are so integrated in nature. And so for us, I think it's really about how do you go back to those NGOs that are community-led? How do you support them with unrestricted funding and capacity building support, enabling them to be the next Magic Buses, Ungans, Educate Girls, and Armans of India? And I think on one hand, to Neera's point, I think we not knowingly, but definitely fell into the trap of going after individuals who I think looked and felt more like us. And I think that was wrong. And I think we're realizing that we need to bring the community voice back. And if it's a messy model, if they don't have things in place, that's actually more of a reason for Dasra to be there, not less of a reason to be there.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to sort of keep going back to learnings, and there's trial and error. We try an idea, we pull out, and we try again. And it's interesting. I think it's the first time I've actually heard you guys talking about this particular thing. But you're talking a lot about working with different kinds of people, and I think with the kinds of ambitions and sort of bold numbers you're talking about. How are you feeling about your own leadership and your own team? I know you capacity build organizations a lot. I guess you used to be a tight-knit husband and wife team, both of you very brilliant, doing everything. But now, as you grow, your role is really about inspiring and, motivating and energizing large numbers of people, lots of stakeholders. So what are you thinking about in terms of your leadership and your teams? How do you make sure you are listening, and how do you make sure people around you are feeling heard, and what's the sort of value you place on that?
So this has, Suparna, clearly been a journey. And yes, it's not only been a husband-wife co-leadership journey, which I see some of you out there in our audience are living the same journey. So it has both its benefits and its challenges, but I think overall it's been obviously wonderful to be committed to Dasra and stay committed to Dasra. So I think there was a part of us perhaps a few years ago or even recently during COVID that you start to ask yourself, are you really of value to this organization? And does it really need, our sets of skills, or is it ready to succeed? And I think there was a time we were asking ourselves, is it time to fully give up the torch? I think, just to be very clear, we still see there's a number of years and passion and a lot of energy left in us to want to contribute. And we believe there's a lot still to do at Dasra and for the sector. But I think nothing excites the two of us more than the leadership that we've grown together within Dasra. So we've not been great, honestly, bringing in people from the outside, and we've been trying to do that to actually fill for our own leadership gaps, to be very honest, because this is our home. This is not only husband and wife, but this is the only after investment banking experience we've ever had. So it's definitely on the job experience, and we tried to fill that with, lateral hires, and that hasn't been successful. But in the process of, leaving lateral hires into the sector to run some amazing things, we've built an incredible leadership team that actually both of us are extremely proud of. And it's almost like we need more of a coming out of each of these individuals to share not just their passions, but what we're most excited about is what each of them are actually leading can take and is taking a life of its own. So there's a lot of opportunities for each of them to learn, growing in responsibilities, being able to contribute to something, and finally being recognized for that. And it reminds me of a paper that Chris Christensen wrote at Harvard Business School, and he'd give it to all of us in class at some point. It's about how do you measure your life? And everybody should actually read it. It's all about how ultimately, if you bring management into your life, you'll be happier. But he talks about these 4 things, and I'm really excited. Both of us are very excited that we're able to create something that can hopefully inspire this group that you're all about to meet.
Yeah, and a lot of your leaders have actually been around, contrary to popular belief, 8-9 years, most of them, right?
Yeah, so, I think all the way to 10, yes. 10 keeps going little, yes.
I have grown Dasra to this point very much along with you. So listen, I do have some questions coming in, and I'm going to ask the first one, and it looks like it's from your amazing supporters, Peter and Lynn Smithams. So they're asking that, they've said we partner closely with you since 2010 and seen lots of change and growth and ambition in Dasra. What has been the greatest learning that is informing your future during the next 2 years, especially with COVID and the last 2 and the next 2 years?
You want to go?
No, you go ahead.
I think Peter and Lynn probably hear too much from me, but thanks for the question. I think there's 2 things that we are really driven by as a result of COVID, but also what you're seeing in this sector is really a need for local philanthropy. How do we have wealth and Indians of wealth give more and grow that pie, because it is the most catalytic philanthropy that can support organizations and sort of their aspirations. We cannot continue to rely on foreign funding, just given our environment. So I see that role in enabling a philanthropic infrastructure that just unlocks that philanthropy in India that's local to be, a priority for us. I think second is really go deeper into the communities to really support these community-based organizations, right? So those have to go hand in hand. With our regulations, you can only support certain kinds of organizations with foreign funding, but with local funding, you can go more local. So I think we're just really pushing for going more and more local to what we're calling the first mile, not the last mile.
Thanks. So there's another question I'm going to ask. While we all realize that collective action and bringing NGOs, givers and governments on a single platform to pursue a common vision is important, what, to your understanding, is going to lead to strong political will to solve issues? For instance, hunger and malnutrition, which are simply not just about service delivery.
Yeah, no, and I think, again, it's about going to the community first. And so our learnings from our work with, whether it's urban sanitation or working with adolescents, I think empowering the communities, first by informing them of what's rightfully theirs, what schemes, policies, programs does the government have, which is supposed to uplift them. I mean, on one hand, I think we're very, very lucky as a nation to have some of the best policies around that exist globally. So unfortunately, though, our communities that these policies are meant for, they themselves are not informed about that. I mean, the government does not do necessarily the good job in marketing what their policies are and how individuals can access these schemes and programs. So I think number one, it starts with that. And I think once you have a community that's educated on what's rightfully theirs and has been passed by the laws, as well as what is the roadways or pathways for them to then demand and get access to those resources. And then finally, what is the feedback loops in place to ensure that once they get access to a program, how are they actually working in partnership with the government and the stakeholders who are focused on delivery to improve upon that delivery? That sort of feedback loop is critical. And I think that's what we've been able to see, that while every NGO has done phenomenal work and will continue to do so in driving their own programs, it's not an either do that or join collectives, it's do that and join collectives. Do that and work with government, do that and work with different funders so they can also start thinking about the root cause of the problem versus just putting band-aids on the issue. And I think to Neera's point, on one hand, while we're so excited about a newer group of philanthropists entering this space, which is absolutely amazing, there will be a learning curve for those philanthropists to understand the sector as a whole, to sort of fight back on their knee-jerk reactions of thinking that just because they were successful in a certain business area, that they also have the solutions here. They need to become active learners and listeners and support the entrepreneurs that are already in these fields, enabling them to grow and scale versus thinking that they're the ones who should own and operate another organization or entity, given that they have not spent the last 30, 40, 50 years focusing on these particular issues. So I think that trust deficit is going to be important, that Dasra needs to help sort of, to create lesser divides between these groups. And as you said, Suparna, to then not worry about whether you're a donor or an NGO or you're a government official, but all of us are working on the joint path of developing the country and really transforming India where a billion thrive with dignity and equity.
Deval, I'm going to combine, based on what you're saying, I'm going to just combine the next two questions because I think there's some sort of, can you address the concern that Dasra is for big NGOs, for the, the English-speaking NGOs? And the next two questions are really about, you've mentioned gender and dignity and inclusion, but how do you plan to engage vulnerable communities, Adivasis, Dalits, who have been systemic victims, this person says. And the next one, similar, but how will you help grassroots organizations? I think people are thinking of hard to reach groups, most vulnerable communities. How do they even access you? And I think, Deval, that is something you've been thinking about in Rebuild. So do share.
Sure. So I think, again, many people know about Dasra because we've worked with groups like Angan Trust, Educate Girls, Arman, Magic Bus, Akshay Patra, Villgro, and others. And the only reason I bring up these examples is all of you NGOs have done phenomenal work. We only started working with you when your budgets were under 30 lakhs or 50 lakhs. And so we've actually had a really great experience in building organizations to have now budgets of 20 crores, 50 crores, or even 100 crores annually. But the most of the work Dasra did is when each of these groups were small and just getting started. And so I think it's really important to realize that our work, while it seems to be with large NGOs, the connections actually started when all of them were just starting off. And so that was actually our core capability and competency. And we're bringing that back as we move forward. To your second question, and I know Vishal will speak a little bit more about this when he's talking about the Rebuild Fund, 90 out of the 150 NGOs we supported in the last year were groups we've never supported before. These are groups that are the small, the ones that are run by proximate leaders, the ones that we also didn't even choose to support. And I say that because we went to Anshu and Gunj and said, look, you work with 500 community-based NGOs across India. Give us 10 that you recommend that we will automatically give funding to. We did the same with RCRC Collective, and Vedaria came back to us with 10 organizations from their collective that we can fund. And that's really the goal here, is how do we go to existing networks, to organizations and individuals who've been in these spaces far longer than Dasra has, and how do we listen to their recommendations, but then provide sort of what our capabilities are, both in convincing donors to give unrestricted or flexible funding, enabling these organizations to grow and scale, similar to what we did with the Magic Buses and the Ungans and the others of the world, but also how do you then provide them capacity building support and a platform where they also can come together, talk about their challenges, and be their own confidants, to accelerate social change.
I just want to add, I would vouch for Dasra and the entire team, that it's not really, unlike a lot of big organizations which sort of fund a small circle of their friends. I think the team takes a lot of effort to go out and make sure that new people are met and that it's a much more accessible thing. And frankly, I mean, we also became friends after we started working together. And I think our budget was what, 2 lakhs a year at the time when we started. So I would vouch for that. But I think it's encouraging for grassroots organizations to hear about that. So the next question is about FCRA, the thing that's on our mind. What challenges does Dasra face with respect to the FCRA and foreign investment, and how do you assist NGOs who are also facing challenges?
So, I mean, I don't think there's anything unique to Dasra in terms of the FCRA challenge. I think we're all a bit on edge waiting for, our approvals to come through. But I think at a higher level, the challenge is how dependent we are on the sector with foreign funding. So as soon as that foreign funding chokes up, you see a lot of organizations actually becoming in survival mode, which just begs the whole need for more local philanthropy. So how do you just raise more flexible funding locally and fund organizations that don't have FCRA is really a big part of our mission and has been going forward, and we see a lot more potential, for that. I think what the FCRA, regulation also choked was the sub-granting ability. So what happened is there were organizations that were hubs for sub-granting that needs to be supported, and you're starting to see mechanisms and ways of folks being able to support those organizations, but you can't get around the FCRA regulation.
But Neera, will you talk a little bit more about Dasra's role in helping organizations become have more flexible funding? Because that's not something that a grassroots NGO has necessarily the ability or the confidence to do. And I'm speaking again from personal experience. How has that been, and what do you do for that?
So, I mean, our what has always been fundamental to Dasra has been core funding to organizations. When we way back started the giving circles, it was all about flexible funding, use it and apply it to these plans and use it for all kinds of budgeted items. What is actually exciting where we are now with the Rebuild Fund, and you'll hear Vishal, is it's small amounts of flexible funding for them to spend however they need to, just as long as, we're achieving the outcomes and having the impact and it's sort of on plan and achieving milestones, but really to give full flexibility. I mean, the biggest challenge here is educating funders that giving flexible funding to an organization means trust, but you'll achieve far more than trying to constrain it all within these budgeted line items and constraining it even more with overhead, right? Part of our challenge, even with FCRA regulations and other regulations, is what's the true cost? to run organizations effectively, I think is a big challenge. And so we do need to continue to change the mindset and influence funders to actually support organizations in a very fundamental way and pay for things that strengthen institutions and build institutions. I mean, that's what this country needs. And we've been doing that from the very beginning, is educating funders on that.
In fact, there's another question about that. In what way have you seen funders' interests and focus change recently? And how is that either helping or challenging what you're trying to achieve? And what advice would you give to funders to help organizations be more effective and supportive towards really, making social change?
Yeah, I guess to begin with, we all have seen in the last 2 years that whatever plans we had and whatever funding we had clearly went for a toss. And so I think, number one, I think hopefully this has given the realization to funders, at least, that whatever you put on paper, the reality is very, very different. And while we as a society, I would say, have been affected by COVID, perhaps for the first time, those of us who are accessing by Zoom and have been traveling by cars, et cetera, and have been on lockdown, most of the communities we serve have had their version of COVID forever. So today we're talking about, for example, enrolling kids and getting them into schools, but what happens when that slum gets demolished? What happens when electricity is not there for a week? What happens when water runs out? These are things that some of us, at least, were just focused or just saw the impact of COVID and how our lives were turned into sort of, where it is today. But the communities we serve have been facing this from day one. And so when we talk about flexible funding, it's actually giving the flexibility and authority to the NGO leader and their management team to make decisions nimbly to actually better meet the needs of their community. And it's not something that's a black hole. When we started out working with groups like yourself, Suparna, and others, I remember what we did, number one, was help each of you sort of create these 3 to 5 year plans. And so within that, you have a plan, you have a budget, and it's really saying the funding then can cover anything that's prescribed in that budget. Now, every 6 months, you and others will go back to your board and philanthropists and funders and say, look, this is how we're now pivoting because we've learned A, B, and C, but you're also not, as a foundation or as an NGO, tied to sort of a line item that you decided 3 years ago that you still need to spend on now because the funder wants you to check off that box. And as ludicrous as that sounds, every NGO knows how funders come to you and say, no, you said this much needs to be spent on that, you have to spend it. So NGOs are actually wasting time and resources in this guise of, oh, we're actually being productive for the funder, when reality is we know a lot of the issues that we thought we were going to focus on 3 years ago and the interventions for that may have changed, and giving that entrepreneur the same flexibility that for-profit investors give. For-profit entrepreneurs is all we're asking for NGO leaders. And then you're really a partner for change. And more importantly, you're enabling them to make decisions that are critical in 2022 versus what they thought the world would look like in 2017, 18, or 19.
Yeah, given all the dramatic things that are happening. So true. And I think timely and sort of responsive funding is life-changing for an organization. So I mean, this just sounds like an amazing, a question that requires you to wear your business hat for a bit. What are big changes that you're seeing in the sector? Do you see a possibility of mergers and acquisitions and things actually happening in our sector?
So I was just about to enter in and say, to Deval's point, and maybe this is a little bit of a business hat, is that, we want funders to think about their funding with the word equity that can mean 2 different things, right? So we started our origins like in thinking about venture capital and then calling it venture philanthropy. And we really think that people should take their grant money and think about it as equity. When you invest in a company with equity kind of capital, not equity from the dignity and equity point of view, although that is exactly what we're saying, enter in with equity and let the organization achieve the social impact and the commitments it's making there. So to your question, which was, what was your question, Suparna? How was more business, what?
Is there scope for things like mergers and acquisitions?
Oh, I've been trying so hard to pursue this mergers and acquisitions piece. I think there's potential, but it has to come from a place of thriving, not a place of surviving. So when you do an M&A transaction and the other side is almost dead, I think that's really hard in the for-profit or the nonprofit sector. But what are our biggest challenges as a nonprofit side is our cultures. So when you do consider this, you have to consider the adaptability and how these cultures are going to come together. So I do think it's a spectrum between the surviving and thriving, and maybe in the middle we could figure that out. I think the first step before we start moving down the M&A path, which was my origins at Morgan Stanley, I think we need to think about collaboration. If we can cooperate and collaborate, I think that's the first step before we can even or should be thinking about M&A, because with sort of collaborative action, we'll all be in a thriving ecosystem.
Thank you. Hey, listen, do we have time for any more audience questions, or can I ask a final question? Maybe there's one. So tell us, what's keeping you excited? What's keeping your team excited? Talk about the future, Neera. What's up next?
So we're both excited and most excited about actually our leadership and the programs and the initiatives that Dasra is embarking on for the next decade. And it probably feels slightly clinical here again that we're putting up this slide, but we're very keen that some structure come as you listen to and hear from the leadership. And what we're most excited about is the leadership and the humility with which this leadership enters into each of these programs, because it's quite audacious and bold what each of these program initiatives are looking to achieve. So I hope you listen to each of their aspirations. And the reason I say humility is because humility actually comes from very strong self-esteem. And I really think that is core to the culture here at Dasra. And you will see each of the leadership here, I think, exude that confidence. And I think it's important for being able to achieve each of these programs. And so, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Shailaja, who leads the Dasra Adolescent Collaborative.
Sorry, Zoom issues, but I hope you all can hear me. Thanks, Suparna, Neera, Deval. That was a lot to think about. But shifting gears, welcome everyone once again to the Dasra Philanthropy Week 2022. I'm Shailaja, representing the 10 to 19 Dasra Adolescents Collaborative. We're a multi-stakeholder platform that accelerates adolescent-first outcomes with funders, civil society, government, and all stakeholders to enable young people in India, especially girls, to achieve their full potential. Like the name our initiative suggests, we literally work with young people within the age group of 10 to 19. And so when I think about my younger self at the age of 18, I remember feeling often alone, confused, lost, and nowhere to turn to for answers. This, even though I came from a very privileged background. And like so many of you, through my student volunteering work, I realized that a vast majority of young people had a reality that was absolutely different to mine. Harsh, difficult, and no real opportunity to even change that reality. And maybe it's this feeling, memory, and experience that has stayed with me, that has kept me in this sector across these 20 years. I started my journey, in fact, with Suparna at Angan, and now at the Dasra 10 to 19 Adolescents Collaborative, I've had this fantastic opportunity to take ownership of the 10 to 19 Collaborative and work with an inspiring team of feminists. We've worked and partnered with many NGOs on the ground and achieved a lot. But it hasn't been easy. It hasn't been without its fair share of challenges. It's been a struggle. And to be honest, we've had some major setbacks also. But what really keeps us going is the kind of change that we've seen in the communities in which we work, the youth champions who keep encouraging us and revising what we need to do, the committed funders who continue to support us, governments, and the sector who is continually ready to partner with us. And all of this has allowed us to achieve our reach of at least 5 million young people across India, drive $78 million of funding to the sector, and build a fabulous network of 280 organizations, all of whom believe in promotion of adolescent health and well-being. To me, the real telling shift has been, when young people actually work with the policymakers and decision makers and give real amazing recommendations on how to change it. And through Meri Bari, we saw, for example, Kruti Kumar represented her recommendations and charters from her peers, and the then Principal Secretary, Mr. Kulkarni, heard her, took her seriously, and initiated a statewide training for all adolescent-friendly health clinics. So some of this only affirms my belief that we have to persevere as a community, as a group, but as an individual as well. And I'm going to leave you with something that has stayed with me for a long time now. I recently heard it, but it means a lot to me. Us subah ko hum hi laenge, wo subah hum hi se aayegi. Only we will give rise to that morning. Only we ourselves can usher in that door. And with that, I hand over to my colleague, Parnasha.
Thank you, Shelja. Good afternoon to all, and a very warm welcome yet again to the Dasra Philanthropy Week 2022. I am Parnasha, and I represent the Urban Sanitation team at Dasra. In fact, I joined Dasra as an analyst, being very hung upon and almost adamant about joining the sanitation team. In fact, taking everyone by surprise back then. I guess they wondered, why would anyone join the sanitation sector in India? I remember reading an article about the 2011 Socio-Economic Caste Survey, which spoke about over 182,000 families being engaged in some form of manual scavenging. And even today, there are about over 54,000 manual scavengers in India. Vulnerable communities have had the highest public health risk because 80% of our surface water and our rivers are being contaminated by fecal matter. In fact, something that has personally stayed with me over the last years is that 30% of the marginalized women in India are assaulted or sometimes raped every year while fulfilling their sanitation needs. And these numbers and many more such stark realities and statistics that spotlight the lack of equity and dignity in the sanitation sector, something that has inspired me personally and the team to continue to strengthen our work focus on urban sanitation over a period of years. At WASH, we're a collaborative platform of over 50 plus NGO partners and organizations working towards moving the discourse around inclusive sanitation through policy recommendations and change. We've had the amazing opportunity to be able to engage with national government departments, ministries, 14 plus states with a vision to ensure that the most vulnerable communities have access to safe and improved sanitation services, and their needs are actually being represented in government priorities, schemes, as well as missions. Through the work we do with our NGO partners, we believe that the urban sanitation challenges, particularly that of the urban poor, require building inclusion and equity in planning, designing, implementation, regulatory and management levels. As a lot of you have already kind of pointed out, Deval pointed it out, Shelja pointed out, that the last 2 years have been particularly very, very tough for us with the pandemic, and it has had a huge personal impact on me. I wondered actually during the lockdown, when the first lockdown was announced in India, that who was collecting our waste every morning? Like I could barely see any person on the road, but who's collecting our waste every morning or cleaning those insanitary toilets we see in the public places? I guess all of us here have taken that service for granted. A group of very silent warriors have shown tremendous courage in city management. Ordinary sanitation workers, in fact, have shown extraordinary leadership role as frontline workers in managing community and public toilets, even in containment zones, something that has personally been a very, very inspiring thought or an inspiring story for me. And as someone in the sector, I realized that their world is often hidden, their woes are unseen, and they are the guardians of public and environmental health in India. A key focus area, therefore, for our work has been to bring in more dignity and rights to the sanitation workforce. Many of the services, many of these who are directly in contact with human fecal matter, Efforts towards mechanizing these services, ensuring proper personal protective equipments for them, necessary skill building and training in managing sanitation infrastructure has been critical for us to ensure a dignified livelihood across the sanitation value chain, which ensures the safety of this community, often deemed to be as the most marginalized group in India. Our vision, therefore, is to drive collective action into urban sanitation and adjacent sectors, be it climate change, environmental protection, public health, to enable citywide inclusive sanitation with access, agency, and decision-making of these communities at the very core of it, making sure that there's an increased focus on solutions that ensure services reach one and all, and these services are being delivered that ensure dignity of our livelihoods for the workers that we work with. I believe that the collective voice and joining forces of all the key stakeholders, including all of you, the civil society, community leaders, government and funding agencies towards sanitation outcomes in India will be the bedrock of what we call as the urban development and resilience in coming years. Thank you. With that, I'll tag Sonvi.
Thanks, Pranasha. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sonvi Khanna, and I'm representing the informal workers portfolio at Dasra. 9 out of my 14 years in development, I have resonated with Dasra's vision of an India where 1 billion can thrive with dignity and equity, and tried contributing to realizing this vision by bringing insight-led advice to philanthropy to help it channel itself towards its most strategic and impactful use. But when as a country, we hit rock bottom in 2020 post the first lockdown and felt farthest from this vision of 1 billion thriving, I actually was on maternity and did little for the larger problem besides supporting those who were in my immediate circle of influence. I think it was most likely that guilt that fed the fire that I felt I had to bring to our work for informal workers when I resumed 6 months later. And little did I know that it would be the journey and the opportunity of a lifetime to trigger lasting change. But it wasn't just me. The team that I have of zealous mission-led folks, we were all quite convinced that this vision of 1 billion thriving cannot be realized until we continue to see the 200 million Indians informally engaged within industry and living at the bottom of India's pyramid as a case for arms, rather than as fellow citizens toiling 12 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week, only to continue with poverty wages as low as $2 to $4 a day, with little knowledge of and access to their entitlements, with health and safety covers that depend on their contracts rather than the risks posed to them by their jobs, with pay, treatment, and opportunities that depend on their gender rather than capability, and despite that bias, do not take into account the intersectionalities that need to be accounted for to enable women to participate, stay, and grow even in the blue-collar ranks of the country. And last but not the least, to continue to be seen as a herd rather than, and as a risk to be mitigated rather than as potential that is to be harnessed. Identified with the help of our NGO partners, Ajivika Bureau and Center for Social Justice, these areas of vulnerability brought informal workers from across industrial sectors to the roads right after the first lockdown, and therefore became the 6 human-centric outcomes around which the social compact and its recommended industry practices and solutions are designed. Founded in 2020, the Social Compact is a multi-stakeholder platform that enables industry to ensure greater dignity and equity for those contributing to the business and adding value to it, even if as temporary, contractual, and supply chain workers. It underlines the need for business to do this not as CSR, but through improved worker practices in business as usual. The compact places the onus on principal companies such as Forbes Marshall, Thermax, Godrej Properties, and many more that sit at the apex of company chains and who have the reputational risk, the worldview, and the wherewithal to trigger more consistent worker practices throughout their chains. Leading with this enablement approach, the Social Compact has triggered systemic impact for over 30,000 workers in 40 principal and supply chain companies, and will expand this movement to benefit over 1 million vulnerable workers and their families over the next 5 years. Business leaders, investors, industry influencers in the room, we need you to invite us in and help India harness the untapped synergy between the future of workers and the future of business in India. Thank you, and we look forward to you joining force. And with that, I'll hand it over to Megha.
Thank you, Sonvi. I hope you all are out there still tuned in. And so a big knock knock and good afternoon to everyone out there. So I started my journey at Dasra after selling Lakme products, shampoos, luxury products, even plus size clothing in the for-profit avatar. And when I started my journey in Dasra, one thing that convinced me that I had come home is the model that Dasra offers, whereby I could leverage my management skills and bring those practices needed to run the business in the for-profit space to the non-profit organizations. The same skills enabled me to partner with Harvard Business School. I had the privilege to conceive and birth the Dasra Social Impact Leadership Program with Neera, where the passion of the non-profit leaders was electric. Their own stories would give me goosebumps, and their challenges fueled Dasra team members to go all out and deliver their best. My own Dasra journey of 9 years and last 2 years of COVID proved why we need philanthropy to be catalytic now more than ever. And I know Neera and Deval shed some light earlier on that, but there's no harm in reiterating. We need to build a community of funders who intend to give, and trust me, give a lot more. But they could benefit with an advisor who can plan and implement their giving more strategically. We need to raise flexible funding geared to help nonprofit organizations build their institutions. We need to raise domestic philanthropy and not over-depend on all the foreign funding, especially with the policies and regulations that keep amending every now and then. And over and above, we need to trust the civil society now more than ever. I lead the catalytic philanthropy team, where my team and I continue to support organizations such as Magic Bus, Akshay Patra, Educate Girls, and 100 other organizations who we've had the pleasure to work with. Dasra's contribution to their institution building has been possible due to the trust and confidence that the leaders have placed in Dasra's capabilities and commitment to the sector. On the other end of the spectrum, individuals such as Nisa Godrej, Anu Aga, Rati Forbes, Dhruv Khaitan, Lynn and Peter Smith, Rohini Nilakani, Hari Menon, Kaku Nakate, and 27 other such families, corporates, and foundations who've held our hands when going was difficult for Dasra, but also encouraged us to be bold and audacious in what we decide as our North Star impact. We continue to provide inside-led advisory in our engagements with NGOs and funders to influence 500 crore rupees in the next 5 years as they shape their journeys to create impact on ground, where a billion thrive with dignity and equity. I invite you all to join this catalytic philanthropy today before it's too late. And with that, I invite Vishal to speak more to this.
Thank you, Megha, and a good afternoon again to everyone. My name is Vishal Kapoor, and like many before me here at Dasra, but also beyond in the sector generally, I transitioned from a corporate job to pursue a career in the social sector. I actually started with Dasra as a volunteer in April 2010, and it was in my first few weeks that I got hooked and requested Deval and Neera to convert me into a full-time role, and the rest, well, as they say, is history. So for me, the aha moment was really during our Dasra Social Impact Program that, Megha, Neera, and others have spoken about. In my first few weeks, we were running our Dasra Social Impact Program for nonprofit leaders, and I had the opportunity to sit alongside a grassroots leader. Her name was Vanita Shinde from Mandeshi Foundation in Maswad, Maharashtra, and learn about the challenges and the potential of empowering rural women with financial access and business literacy, as well as how NGOs like Mandeshi organize themselves to help India's poorest. Together, we were able to develop an elevator pitch and a scaling plan, which actually helped Mandeshi win a mock pitch to funders during the session. And I was just, so incredibly proud of that small thing, and way prouder, way happier with myself than I'd sort of ever been in my professional life. And I've remained proud, to be working with Dasra for almost 12 years now, where my role has evolved from diligence and capacity building to cultivating philanthropy for India from a global audience, and most recently to leading our Rebuild India Fund. And so you've heard about this a little bit before. The Rebuild India Fund is a joint initiative by Dasra and Tarsadia Foundation. And it's really a response to the vulnerabilities we saw exposed during COVID, as well as the regulatory changes that have disproportionately affected smaller NGOs in India. At different points over the past 2 years, we saw 286 million children affected by school closures, 230 million Indians falling below the poverty line, 60% of NGO leaders from minority communities themselves with less than 3 months of finances to continue operations. We believe there's an urgent need for the philanthropic community to support the resilience of India's grassroots nonprofits through long-term flexible funding so they can survive these uncertain times and continue to help India's most marginalized and vulnerable communities. The Rebuild India Fund will raise and deploy $50 million towards 100 new and small community-based nonprofits every year and make 5-year commitments of funding and capacity building support to them. And a lot of what I'm saying right now, personally for me, takes me back to Dasra's engagement with Vanita Shinde from Mandeshi those 12 years ago, and a deep belief that Dasra is uniquely positioned to identify and surface such leaders, to connect them with the philanthropy mainstream. And in doing so, to shift power to the front line and build a more empathetic philanthropy ecosystem. And what gives me confidence in being able to do so is the fact that we're already on this journey. Since April 2021, at the peak of the second wave of COVID in India, we have identified and channeled over $8 million to 150 nonprofits for COVID relief grants, placing the NGOs' needs at the center and designing a rapid granting process around their needs. And here we're talking about organizations like Prabhat Education Foundation, Kotara Adivasi Sangathan, Jan Chetna Manch Bokaro, Vagdhara, MAS, Sadbhavna Trust. These are groups that are small. They all have budgets of anywhere from 20, 30 to 40 lakhs up to maybe 90 lakhs to a crore. And are working with the most underprivileged, are probably names that most of us in the funding community have not heard before. And we've realized as Dasra, there's a wealth of organizations and amazing leaders beyond this. And I welcome you all to join us, to join this movement, and more specifically to join us to learn more about the Rebuild India Fund at 2:30 p.m. on Thursday, March 24th, where we officially launch the fund and take questions from the audience. And with that, I'd love to hand over to my colleague, Jyotirmoy. JC, over to you.
Thank you, Vishal. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me share a quick statistic that I believe we need to change. In India today, there are around 14,000 ultra-high net worth individuals and around 140 billionaires, each of whom have a potential of contributing, let's say, upwards of 4 to 5 crores annually towards philanthropy. But guess what? There are today, as of today, only around 100 such people who actually contribute more than 5 crores. 100 people out of a potential of 14,000 people, and that's a massive gap. And I'm not even mentioning the giving potential of approximately 3 lakh high net worth individuals in India. That's the problem Philanthropy Labs is trying to solve for. My name is Jyotirmoy Chatterjee. I've largely been an entrepreneur in the social impact space for more than 13 years now. And at Dasra, I passionately lead the Philanthropy Labs team incubated this year. Our goal at Labs is to innovate and strengthen India's philanthropy infrastructure and ecosystem to accelerate focused family giving for India's most marginalized communities. As part of fulfilling Dasra's goal of leading a philanthropy movement, over the next decade, there are 4 key things that we're kind of focusing on. 1, later this year, we're aiming to launch an exclusive and private network specifically for family philanthropists. This network aims to serve as a one-stop destination to these family givers for their philanthropy needs by providing them access to relevant networks, knowledge, and tools to accelerate their giving. Second, We aim to lead narrative change around family philanthropy to further the culture of giving in India by putting out relevant thought leadership and research, showcasing champions and approaches, and celebrating philanthropy to nudge family givers to give more and give better. Third, while on one end we will nurture a community of family givers, on the other end, we aim to aggregate and curate a community of trusted nonprofits, experts, and service providers who can work with these givers to drive equitable philanthropy. Lastly, our goal will be to consistently innovate by creating newer narratives, vehicles, and platforms that can truly unlock the potential of family philanthropy for India. As we build this out, we will strongly be leveraging 22 years of Dasra's knowledge, experience, and networks to achieve our goals. Over the next 10 years, we aim to foster and influence a community of 5,000 families from India and across the world who annually channelize $1 billion worth of philanthropic capital to social causes in India. We believe this will unleash a philanthropy movement and truly achieve Dasra's vision of catalyzing impact for 1 billion Indians to thrive with dignity and equity. Thank you, everyone. Back to you, Suparna. Suparna, you're on mute.
Thanks. It was great to hear from the leadership team, all your passion and energy. It's always exciting to hear what hooks you to the sector, because I'm sure you're going to pay it forward and get a lot more people hooked and passionate about the sector. Before we wrap, I hope you found this session informative and interesting, and it gave you some insight into how the Dasra leadership is feeling and thinking about things. I know that the Dasra leadership team has worked to articulate some sort of goals and around their mission, and can we maybe play the Dasra video around your manifesto. And thank you everyone for being with us during this session. Not sure why the video is not playing, but just to announce that at 2:30, there's an exciting session coming up it's called Dare to Lead. It's about empowering women for inclusive cities. So hopefully you will come back and attend. Thanks so much. Bye, everybody.
There are also similarities across different continents.
It begins with recognizing the deep inequities that live among us.
All of you are aware we have been spending
By making visible the invisible and bridging these vast divides, it sparks determination, not pity. It demands challenging the status quo, the courage to take paths less traveled, and the willingness to immerse in the shared truths of our vulnerabilities. It makes philanthropy work for communities, not for privilege. It calls for nurturing trust and radical kindness, the empathy to explore possibilities, and the humility to accept these in our oneness. It's the fierce ambition to be uncompromising, to satiate the hunger for learning, and to have the audacity to amplify the most vulnerable of voices. It